This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on the activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we are going to speak with Dan Sohege. He is the director of the human rights advocacy organisation Stand for All. So we have a new government here in the UK, you might have heard about that. So I thought it was a good idea to get Dan on to give us his analysis of the Labour Party's plans for asylum seekers. It's a bit of a mixed bag. Dan is also going to tell us about Labour's plans to increase immigration raids and how this will only make things worse for the victims of trafficking. And we also discussed the recent far-right riots happening across the country and how our media and politicians bear a lot of the blame for the violence we're seeing. So before we get on with today's episode, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast. We've also got a blog. You go to civilfleet.com to read news stories, investigative reports, and some interviews and all kinds of things there. I haven't updated it in a while, but I'll get back to writing some stories soon. But mostly focusing on the podcast at the moment, but do go check out the blog. Also, if you like what we're doing and you'd like to help us to continue to platform the amazing people that we've had on the Civil Fleet podcast, and if you want to get access to our bonus episode that's on there, you can make a small donation at co-fi.com/civilfleet. Donate the price of a coffee, or donate loads of money if you like. You can help us to cover the cost of running this thing and to platform people, and you'll get access to the bonus episode there too. So that if you'd like to donate, you can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet, and any donations that you make will be greatly appreciated. Oh yeah, and I always forget to say this, but do share the podcast around, give us some ratings on podcast apps and things like that. That would also really help. If you can't chuck us any money, do us a solid and give us a rating somewhere. Only good reviews, please. Right, okay, so let's get on with the episode. Thank you very much for coming on the Civil Fleet, Dan.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Ben. It's great to be here.
I've been following you on social media for quite a long time. I've been retweeting your stuff and reading your things, agree with most of the things pretty much everything that you say. It's really good.
That's good to hear.
Actually, I hate everything you say. No, yeah. So it's been really good to get you on the podcast. We're going to try and say your surname one more time. Dan Sohege.
Sohege. Yeah.
Okay, I know. So you are director of Stand for All. I think you're a specialist in refugee and human rights, this kind of stuff.
Yep.
You can tell us a bit more about that, but before we get going, we're going to talk today about we have a new government in the UK. We're going to talk about Labour's policies, what they're planning to do with asylum seekers, refugees, people on the move, and we'll also talk a bit about the crazy riots that have been happening here in the last few days.
Yeah.
But yeah, so before we get into all of that, Dan, could you tell us about yourself and how did you get involved in this kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, my background originally is as a journalist, and did that for a number of years. Ended up moving out to North Cyprus and editing newspapers and doing broadcast TV. And then when I moved back to the UK, we didn't really realise how bad the economic crash was affecting the UK when we moved back, because North Cyprus being slightly insulated from that. I went, I need to find a new job. What am I good at? So I moved into communications side of things. But because of what I'd been doing, I wanted to not be on the side of the sort of broadcast where you're reporting on stuff. I wanted to have a more active role in trying to make things better for people and change things. So I retrained, got a degree in international relations and economics, got a master's in international refugee law, and one thing led to another. And the day after the 2019 general election, I looked at how everything had been reported and went, there's some really bad comms going out there on migrants' rights in particular, but social justice issues. So I set Stand for All up, which we're a consultancy, bring in all sorts of different people depending on the needs, but we work on helping organisations, individuals, businesses, even some politicians, for example, on how to properly advocate for migrants' rights, how to get policy ideas which are factually based rather than rhetorically based, which obviously a lot of them are. And we work with them, but we also advocate, I do a lot myself, of advocating for trying to combat misinformation when it comes to migrants' rights, and particularly with asylum seekers at the moment. So we look very carefully at, okay, this is what people are saying on this side, this is what the reality is, how can we communicate that in a way that people will understand? And then we share that with other people to help them.
Well, that's really great. Because it's so important, the rhetoric around asylum seekers, especially the last, 20 years, has been absolutely awful. I saw someone online recently, they shared a really interesting infographic, which I can send to you afterwards, and I'll link in the show notes. And it was basically a load of all the headlines. He collated like 20 years of headlines, and it just went through. And it's so grim reading them. It's just like, it's unbelievable. Like the things that people say, or the things that journalists will write about asylum seekers. The disinformation is unreal.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah, there's so much out there, and so much of it has been mainstreamed as well, and just taken as, oh well, it's been repeated so many times that even broadcasters who should know better are repeating it as fact because it's been said so many times.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that, and it's really surprising. I think if you took a time machine just back 10 years and you went to now, you'd be really surprised at like mainstream politicians, conservative politicians, essentially saying the things that the far right would have said before. Now it's just normalised.
Yeah. Oh, totally. We look at look at some of the language that Suella Braverman was using. That was language that would have previously made her have the whip removed for being conservative. Instead, she was kept on as Home Secretary for saying it. So, yeah, this is a huge, huge issue with the language around it.
I'll just say, because we have a lot of listeners from abroad, mostly I can see a lot of people from Germany listening to this podcast. So I'll just say Suella Braverman was our Home Secretary, which is like, I think in Germany, it's like the Secretary, what are they called? Homeland... Interior Minister, that's what they're called,
That's the one, yeah. I think that's the one, yeah.
Great, well, thanks very much for that, Dan. Let's talk about... So I often write questions beforehand and then go completely off script, but let's try and stick to this script. Well, let's talk about the previous government, which is the Tory government, which is Suella Braverman was part of, the Conservative government. Could we talk a bit about their previous policies? They had some crazy stuff, like the Rwanda scheme. We've had people on the podcast talk about that. We've had people talk about the Bibby Stockholm, which was this huge boat that was holding asylum seekers on there. Then,
that was tragic, yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know, maybe you can give us the greatest hits, as it were.
I'm not sure we have time. There were so many. I mean, obviously the Rwanda policy was a sort of flagship policy on this, which always struck pretty much anybody, even those on the right, who had any knowledge about motivations and drivers for asylum, as quite an insane plan, to be honest. It was clearly never going to work. The former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, had, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, already lambasted it as being a ridiculous idea. The former Home Secretary, James Cleverly, when he was Foreign Secretary, reportedly called it batshit. I don't know if I can say that on your podcast, but yes. So this was a policy that even Conservative MPs and senior MPs knew was a bad idea. It had already been tried before. Israel did a similar scheme with Rwanda, but it was voluntary, and that's a key part of this. And they removed 4,000 asylum seekers to Rwanda, who pretty much all were trafficked back into Europe within a very short period of time. So it was already shown that this doesn't work. So that's obviously one of the big policies that was completely ridiculous. But then they had more sort of performative cruelty policies. You mentioned the Bibby Stockholm, which was only ever meant to be a symbol for them of this is how nasty we can be. Because it was never a suitable place for accommodation. People kept going, oh, well, it's been used for oil workers and stuff. Yes, this was a boat that was nearly, I think, 50 years old. They'd gutted it and doubled the capacity of it. So you were having people crammed into it. And people who had no idea how long they were going to be into it. Now, an oil rig worker knows how long they're going to be somewhere. and knows they're getting out of it. So obviously when you've got that indefinite detention type of thing going on, it adds to stress. But on a sort of more, I dare say, funny note, some of the stuff that they leaked to the press as ideas were just quite off the wall. Wave machines in the Channel was one of them. There was a lot of talk right up until the election, I believe it was. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the Conservative MPs, was talking about it, of building a wall, whether floating or otherwise, was never fully addressed, down the centre of the English Channel, which is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Jet skis to stop people, which was pretty quickly pointed out by the Coast Guard of, well, that's going to capsize the dinghies if you do that, which means more loss of life. There's all these sorts of things. And then there's a lot of misinformation. We've seen quite a number of MPs saying, oh, it's perfectly legal to just take people back to France. It is not legal in any way, shape or form to do that. Whether that's via refugee law, where you are, if someone seeks asylum in your territory, you are supposedly required to at least process the application, or maritime law, where you have to protect life at sea, or the not insignificant fact that most states don't like you taking your border patrols into their waters and then dropping people off randomly on their beaches. That tends to annoy nation states when another nation state does it. So these were all absolutely ridiculous ideas, but they just kept coming out with them because they grabbed headlines. They knew they wouldn't work. They made a rod for their own back, in fact, because the more they didn't work, the more they were seen to fail, and the more the story got salience in the minds of the people we're seeing rioting, for example, at the moment.
Yeah, and it's like, it's crazy that they kept, because all the whole time with that government, the previous government, I kept wondering, are they doing this because they think it's going to work? Or are they doing this because they're just trying to back up, the right, basically? They want to secure the right vote. They're appealing to them. I think it's the latter. But, yeah, and then I just got, like, you're talking about pushing people back across borders. Can you imagine the outrage if France dropped people off here? We're like, yeah, they're your problem now.
Exactly, yeah. It was never going to work. It's really crazy things that they were doing, but they just kept coming out with this because they thought it would appeal to a certain element, and the element they were trying to appeal to, and I'm trying to be fairly polite here, I'm sure I'll get a little bit more vocal when we start talking about riots and things later on, you're never going to be able to go far enough for them. There's never going to be a level by they're going to go, oh, well, okay, that's fine, then we're quite happy now. It just won't work like that. It doesn't work like that. So
yeah, and that's what I was trying to say. Like you said, like they're never going to succeed at this. They can keep coming up with these insane policies, but it doesn't work. It's illegal. It won't stop people coming anyway. And it's just mad. And they set themselves up to fail. So no wonder Reform took half their votes.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And Reform, I've just mentioned, there are another political party in the UK that's pretty right wing, much further to the right than the Tory, the Conservative Party, and they would base their whole election campaign was all about migration, essentially, I think.
Yeah. Oh, they monopolised it, and they turned a lot of people are calling this the migration election, the one we've just had, because Reform was able to take that place and shape the narrative of it, and the Conservatives let them. But yeah, it was crazy.
I was thinking about this the other day. Maybe this is better to save for later, but I'm going to ask it now because I like going off script. I can't see, migration is always this huge issue in the news. It's like the news is always telling you that migration is an issue, but I don't know how it affects people in their daily lives. If there's people coming on boats in the UK, don't see how it affects people living in Rotherham, or obviously it does in some ways, but it really gets to me.
It's such a big issue when it comes to people seeking asylum in the news and from politicians, and particularly channel crossings. But we had, I think it's 69,000 asylum applications last year. So out of a population of 67 million people, that's a small proportion. Of those, roughly half crossed the channel. So you still talk about, I know that some people see these as big numbers, but when you look at them in terms of a nation state and overall, they're really, really small numbers that we're talking about. And prior to what is known as the Illegal Migration Act, which was passed by the previous government, we were processing applications, but that act actually stopped them from processing applications. It did absolutely nothing to stop people coming. So it just meant that you had more people who were in hotels, in camps, on the Bibby Stockholm. It made the situation worse for them because they could keep going, oh, look, we haven't got all these asylum applications. Yeah, but you have all these people. They haven't disappeared, and people are seeing them, we know they're there. So it was absolutely ridiculous how they were trying to deal with it. But it's such a small thing on the grand scheme of things, which has very little impact on people's lives. And there were policies around asylum which could actually benefit everybody, which they didn't look at.
And one of the things that the far right will often say is the migration is a drain on the NHS. But if you go to the NHS, a lot of the people that work there are migrants, right? Or from a migrant background. It's really beneficial to us.
Absolutely. The NHS is, without migrants, the NHS would collapse overnight. They form so many different roles in it. But also what people don't look at is a lot of migrants pay what's known as the immigration health surcharge. And that is a huge amount of money they have to pay every year. It costs more than an average private medical insurance for them. Now that's on top of paying taxes, which most migrants do because they're working and everything else. That money, if they lost the money made by the immigration health surcharge, lost migrants in general, the NHS funding crisis would shoot through the roof in a second. So all of this talk about migrants who are a drain on public services, migrants are the ones who are currently propping up public services. It's calculated migrants pay more into the economy than they take out, whereas native-born citizens take out more from the economy than they pay in overall. They also use public services less. Yeah, most migrants, when they come over working age and then leave and go back home after a period. So they're using the services less, they're paying more into them. The arguments about public sector crashing because of migration is completely the opposite of the reality of it.
Yeah, that's crazy. And then, that's the point I think people often forget is a lot of people that migrate, that move to other countries, they don't intend to stay there forever. They might do, and that's completely up to them. I think people should live where they want. But people often. I was recently in Bosnia. I did a few episodes on Bosnia, and I met a lot of people on the move there. And I met this one guy I interviewed. I think he was from Morocco, and he was just reminded me of me when I was in my 20s. And he was just chasing his dream. He wanted to move to Italy, become a model. And I just thought, why can't he do that? I could travel all over the world and work pretty much wherever I wanted. But for him, it's like a massive uphill battle. He has to deal with fleas and scabies and stuff. It's just awful, yeah. But that's a really good point. Yeah. People come and then they might leave eventually.
Yeah, exactly. And that's always forgotten somehow, but yeah.
So we've got a new government. That was so pleased to get rid of the Tories. That was so nice to see them go away and lots of them losing their seats. That was really nice. Isn't it called Schadenfreude or something when you take pleasure from other people's pain?
That's the one.
But yeah, I wasn't very enthused personally with the Labour government, particularly during the election campaign when they were talking about Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, was saying, he was talking about Bangladeshis, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was along the lines of Bangladeshis are not being sent back home, and it was just so pandering to the right, really pissed me off. Anyway, I don't know. What did you think of the election campaign from Labour?
I had some very big issues when it came to terms of migration because a lot of the language of it, they had a perfect opportunity to start reshaping the narrative on this and showing the positives of immigration. And there was so much out there which was still just, it was saying, well, we'll be more competent at doing this than the Conservatives, rather than let's actually look at humane policies which benefit everybody. Yeah, a lot of it was very depressing to hear, to be honest. It wasn't what you'd hope for.
Yeah, it was pretty sad. And it looks like they didn't, I think their plan was to sort of gain some right-wing votes, I guess. But it doesn't look like, to me at least, from my amazing analysis, that they got that vote. It looks like the Reform sliced the Tory vote in half. But I suppose this is for another podcast, I suppose.
Well, just very, very quickly on that, what was interesting was, yes, Reform got seats, but the Liberal Democrats and the Greens took far more seats on very positive messages about immigration. So it showed, I think, that people do believe and go, oh, actually, we can look at these positives. And that's where we need to be angling for now.
Yeah, I was really happy to see a lot of 4 green seats. That's great. All right, so let's talk about the new government, the Labour Party government, sort of a centre-left government. Can you talk about their policies? I think a few weeks ago they talked about what their policies regarding migration were going to be. Can you tell us about Labour's policies?
Yeah, so, okay, I will grant they haven't been in power long. There's still plenty of time, and I'm hoping that we can help shape that and influence it. But it's been a mixed bag, to say the least. From day one, they cancelled the Rwanda plan, absolutely brilliant, but any government was going to have to do that, because it's estimated it was already at about £700 million it had cost. It was never going to work, so that was always going to have to happen. They've cancelled the contract for the Bibby Stockholm, so from January, nobody will be housed on that. That's great. Personally, I do think they should be trying to get people off the Bibby Stockholm faster than that, but it's a good start that they are cancelling that. But they've also started to talk about enhanced enforcement, increasing border force. Now, this is the same sort of policy as we saw with the previous government when they brought in what was known as the Clandestine Channel Threat Commander, which was quite a spectacular failure. And the problem is that every piece of evidence shows that when you focus on making it harder for people to seek asylum, when you make it harder for them to get access to the territory, you actually increase the grip of the bigger gangs. Because most crossings are actually what's called self-facilitated. They're small groups of friends, family, they get the dinghy themselves, they come across. Now, they don't have all the contacts, and there is corruption going on, which the gangs utilise to be able to avoid border force. So they get picked up. So it means that people then start having to use the actual gangs to get through. And they don't care who lives or dies. They're not on the boats. They force people to drive the boats. So that's a really concerning one, because it's not looking at how we can protect lives and how we can actually, we need to be making it safer and simpler for people to come. Other policies which are very concerning is talks of increasing returns agreements. Now, again, we know these don't work. We know these can be incredibly harmful. The previous government brought one in for Albania. Albania has high levels of trafficking. Albanians are one of the most trafficked groups within the UK. What we saw with that, because there is some state complicity with trafficking in Albania, and it doesn't matter if that's just one police officer or 1,000, if you are scared that you go to the authorities and they're going to pass you on to the traffickers and tell them they've ratted you out, you can't go to the authorities. So we are seeing an increase in Albanian trafficking via different routes now. Going back to the old back of a lorries thing, coming across from Spain to Portsmouth is one route in particular. So these don't work. They just force people into a cycle of predominantly exploitation, because they've run out of money to pay the smugglers. So they have to rely on the traffickers, and smugglers take a one-off fee, traffickers exploit them over long terms. So that's a very concerning one. So they have got some good policies they've brought in, but some of them are very, very concerning. Another one they've suggested is offshoring. Now, offshoring can lead to serious problems. We've seen this with Australia, for example. It doesn't solve the issue. It doesn't stop people wanting to come to the UK, because, as I said, it's actually a relatively small number of people who seek asylum in the UK. And they come because they tend to have existing ties here. Now, no amount of border force or offshoring changes the fact they've got those ties, so they're going to feel safer in the UK. So it doesn't stop them coming. What it can do is stop them seeking asylum, so they then go underground, become undocumented, and are again at more risk of exploitation. So yes, it's they really need to rethink some of the policies and focus more on the positives that they're doing.
Yeah, I'm so glad that they've scrapped Rwanda and they got rid of the Bibby Stockholm while getting in the process of getting rid of it.
Yeah.
I had a podcast, a previous podcast with a group called Reclaim the Sea, and we talked a lot about the Bibby Stockholm and the protest they were doing against it. So people should check that out. And then also interestingly, I interviewed someone from the PCS, the Public and Commercial Services Union, and I can't remember their name. I think they're Assistant General Secretary now. But anyway, they talked about the border guards themselves protesting against this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which was
absolutely.
really interesting.
There was a lot of that going on, particularly over the Rwanda plan, that they were saying, no, we won't do this.
Yeah, because they didn't want to be complicit in human rights crimes, essentially, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's violating international law.
And so, yeah, I think one of the sad things I've seen Labour talk about, like, it's really annoying when they talk about we're going to be more competent, when it's about an issue of competency. It's like, we're going to be evil better. So it just seems worse. But one of the things they're talking about doing now is sending out immigration raids to. I remember from the headlines and stuff that they want to send immigration raids to like salons and car washes, where I think there's, like you were saying, there's a lot of victims of trafficking in those places. Do you know much more? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is the plan that they're going to increase immigration rates. Now, first of all, that doesn't actually stop people being exploited because, again, the people who are trafficking and exploiting people are not the ones who are caught up in immigration raids. It's the people who are being exploited. So you're automatically targeting victims by doing this. They're also... they sort of ignore the fact that a lot of people working in these areas are here perfectly legally anyway and are documented in doing so. Immigration raids tend to be incredibly racialised when they come through. And we see plenty of stories where immigration raid has gone in somewhere and everybody's there going, oh, yeah, hi, here's my documents, I'm perfectly legit. And the one white person who is undocumented, they haven't spoken to at all. So these, they don't work, they don't help. You end up detaining people when they are in a situation of exploitation. You're detaining the victims, not the employers. They need to be looking at policies which go far higher up and really combat this. But also policies which help people regularise their status. So it's easier for people, because most people become undocumented through no fault of their own. An organisation called JCWI, Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, did a report on this, and from the people they surveyed, I think it was about 87% of them who had become undocumented. It was through no fault of their own. They had come here perfectly legally, through visas and everything else, but just Home Office errors, a change of address, and so. And once you drop out of the system, it is incredibly hard to get back in. It would be a lot more effective if we started just going, okay, right, we're going to regularise their status, make it easier for them to get status again so they can work in wherever they need to. And that combats it far faster and far better than just sending in raids, arresting people, detaining them, deporting them, and then we go back to that whole cycle of exploitation that can happen again.
And I think, like, targeting these people, particularly people who are victims of trafficking, must be great for the traffickers, because you've got constant supply of, you get people for a little bit, they go away, then you get someone else and they go away. Like,
there's that, but also on a very scary fact of previous roles, I've worked a lot with trafficking survivors, and what the gangs do, and what they were doing after the Albanian agreement, for example, the gangs were saying, if you try and escape, you will be sent back to Albania. Now, the gangs are still in Albania, and they will then say, right, we don't know if you've spoken to the authorities or not. You've tried to escape from us once, so we're going to make an example of you. So it actually puts people at more risk by doing this. The gangs are using, and they were using the previous governments very much so, and we saw this quite often, the government's policies as a threat against the people they're exploiting to tighten their grip on them and prevent them being able to seek assistance and seek safety.
Mm. Yeah, that's really grim, actually. Definitely, and I think if you're sending people back to authoritarian governments as well, then that can put them in a lot of danger going back home, right?
Exactly. And the Rwanda policy was being used quite often by gangs to say, if you try and seek safety, you'll get sent to Rwanda, so you better stick with us.
And it's an excuse, I guess, for them to put the price up as well, right? Because they can be like, yeah, we're at risk now. You can, and then I know from a lot I've done on Libya, a lot of the episodes and I've done right for the civil fleet, is that people tend to, like, if they don't have enough money, then they're the ones that have to drive the boat, right? I think if you drive the boat, you don't pay as much as everyone else.
That's with the smuggling gangs. The smuggling gangs and trafficking gangs are different. Trafficking gangs, actually, channel crossings and driving the boats, trafficking gangs make a very small proportion of that. It's mainly smugglers. Now, smugglers work on a almost transactional, right? You pay us the money, we'll get you across. Think of it as a taxi service of sorts. If you don't have the money, yes, they can do you a cut price to drive the boat. More often than not, though, they will actually threaten people to drive the boat and say, look, we've got all your contact details, we know where your family is, we know where your friends are. If you don't drive the boat, we're going to make them suffer. So that's one of the ways. The trafficking gangs, though, they use long-term exploitation, so you don't have to pay them up front. They say, right, okay. And they'll often try and feed people ideas of a better job, a better life, and then once they're here and they bring them through official ports of entry, then they've got them trapped. And their thing is keeping that grip over them while they're here, so they can't seek any assistance and can't say, look, I've been trafficked by a criminal gang. And that's the threats that they're using with things like the Rwanda policy going, if you try and escape, we'll take you. We'll get you.
Yeah, that's really scary, isn't it? Because you've just tightened the grip of the traffickers there, right?
Exactly.
I'm glad you did that, because that's something I keep getting wrong, and I get called out for it quite a lot. The difference between smuggling and trafficking, and I keep trying to remind myself of that. So thanks for going through that again, Dan. So what else do we talk about? Labour, hotels, and then I suppose we can move on to the far right after this one. What's going on with the hotels?
Well, one of the good things that Labour's done is they're starting to process applications again. And that's the only way to help people out of hotels. So they have said they want to start reducing the number of people in hotels, which is great because people have this idea of these 5-star hotels and stuff. They're not. Even ones which have been good hotels, and people go, oh, well, I went on holiday to that hotel. Oh, great, lovely. What they do, the operators, is strip them back to bare bones, cram people into the rooms in a lot of cases. I mean, they don't even have a kettle to make their own cups of tea. They are entirely reliant upon the service providers in a lot of places. So it's good that they're trying to get people out of the hotels. I would personally say they can do it a lot faster, because if you take... People always talk about the money that things cost to do this. It's not new money. You can actually just reallocate. So instead of investing in tougher policies, you invest in what are known as community schemes. And we've seen these work. They're a lot cheaper. They support everybody in a community by developing infrastructure in a community. And people can live in homes, often with other people. Great charities like Refugees at Home work on this as well. And those are far more humane and far more cost effective, and is something that hasn't really been spoken about at the moment, of coming up with alternatives to the hotels, because no matter what happens, people are going to continue seeking asylum in the UK. So unless you're looking at alternative, more humane accommodation, there are still going to be people who end up stuck in hotels at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad, because that's the thing. I think a lot of people think that the hotel experience is like 5-star jacuzzis, like this cost the taxpayer lots, but it's those companies, I can't remember who they are, but there's several companies, I think groups like Corporate Watch have done stuff on this, I'm not entirely sure, on who's running these hotels. So yeah, that's really grim. And then before we talk about the riots, what's the I don't know if they said much about, Labour's talking about creating a border security command. Have they said much about this? I haven't really read too much about it.
It all seems to be a bit vague and hazy at the moment, but from what we're getting through, it seems to be just almost a renaming and bolstering of the former border force and clandestine channel threat commander policies that we saw from the previous government. I could be wrong. We need more information on it. But as it stands at the moment, it looks like just the same policy reframed, repackaged, and potentially increased.
Right, so that's great.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
All right. So, was there anything else you wanted to say about Labour before we talk about the riots and the current government's policies?
I'm not sure we have time to go into all of it, but I think one of the key things that we need to look at, and it sort of tracks through to talking about the riots, is we're still seeing a lot of language of the use of illegal for migration rather than irregular, for example. Fairly hostile language that creates an othering effect for migrants. It creates this idea that there is something wrong with them. And that language still feeds into the almost normalisation of the anti-migrant attitudes that we're seeing, and we're seeing on display with the riots. So what I think Labour really need to be doing is totally U-turning on that use of language. Stop talking about tougher, harsher criminalisation. We've seen them talking about using terrorism laws against gangs. Now, that's great to tackle the gangs. We all want to do that. But it's that use of language. People don't hear the gangs. They see the people who are coming seeking safety and associate it with them, which then feeds into this mindset that we're seeing create a lot of this violence at the moment. So it's not down to Labour's... They haven't been in long enough to have caused what the situation is now, but they need to dial back the rhetoric and start talking about positives of immigration and talk about migrants as human beings in order to prevent this sort of violence in the future.
That's something I think is really important, is talk about migrants as human beings. I go out of my way quite often when I write stories about asylum seekers, refugees and stuff. I go out of my way to not use the word migrant. And also asylum seekers and refugees quite often. I try to just refer them as people.
Exactly.
And I think it's so important to not always talk about them as migrants, because then it's an othering thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything should be framed on being human beings, and that's crucial, I think.
So this weekend, we're talking on August the 6th. Hopefully we'll get this episode out very soon to that date. And so over the weekend, it's Tuesday today, and the weekend has just gone. And actually before that, I think sometime last week, there was a murder in Southport, which is a town in the north of England by the sea, I think, near Liverpool, isn't it?
Yep, it's where I used to grow up. Liverpool and Southport. Yep, that's where I grew up, worked and went to school, in that sort of area, in the whole area.
And there was a young boy, attacked, I want to make sure I'm getting this right, attacked a dance school and killed at least 3, I can't remember the number now, but there was
Killed 3 children, wounded more, included, I think it was 5 more were wounded, plus 2 adults. The lad was born in Cardiff, but there was immediately, within a very short space of time after it, misinformation that he was a Muslim asylum seeker. So
there was far-right agitators online, right? People like Tommy Robinson,
yes.
And what's that guy? We don't really need to say his name, but there's a guy who's in Romania, man's rights activist, a total prick. He was out there saying like these are people using like the Great Replacement conspiracy theories and Muslims taking over the world and just awful shit. And this has been spreading not just then though, right? It's been going on for years.
Yeah, this isn't a new thing. Southport, they used the Southport attack as an excuse, but if it hadn't been Southport, it would have been something else. This has been boiling up for a long time. We've seen attacks against asylum accommodation before. Knowsley, they attacked a hotel there. So this isn't new, but they used it as a spark to create what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, so they were like saying this is a Muslim that's come here and done this, but like you said, this is a boy who was born in Cardiff. No connection to Islam at all, and like, I mean, obviously that's completely irrelevant. Someone's a religion.
Absolutely, yes.
And so then, yeah, this is sparked riots, and I don't know. I went on a counter protest this weekend in Manchester. So what's your take on all of this? What's been happening?
It's hideous. As you said, 3 young children were murdered in a brutal way. And instead of talking about them, thinking about the community and their families, we're now all having to focus on these far-right thugs who are attacking our streets, attacking minorities. We have seen them try and set alight to asylum accommodation, to a hotel, throw acid in the face of innocent women. They destroyed a library in Liverpool. You know, there's a lot of commentators, some mainstream commentators, saying, oh, well, these are ordinary citizens with legitimate concerns, in inverted commas. At no point does any of this come even remotely in the realm of legitimate. The far right, though, do make up a very small minority, but they're incredibly vocal, and they're very good at weaponising people's fears. So going back to that hostile rhetoric we've seen from politicians over the years, people believe it, they buy into it. You know, if all you ever see is negative stories about migrants, and you're in a situation where you're struggling to afford the rent, you don't know how you're going to afford to pay the bills that month, yeah, you're going to buy into the idea that somebody else is to blame. That far right minority plays on that to escalate those fears, and that's how we see this. So originally, not my personal view is that, you know, there is no justification for any of this, but I know some people who are making the argument that the initial protests were a breaking point. They were people who had all this hostile rhetoric, agitated them by the far right online and in person, because we know they are bussed into areas to do this, and that's where that came from. At this stage in the game, after all the violence we've seen, after the chants, after people throwing up Nazi salutes, there is no excuse for any of this. It's, if you are joining those protests, well, they're not protests, they're riots. Let's be honest. Let's call them what they are. And only today I was seeing this in the news, former senior police officers are saying, no, this has crossed the line into terrorism. And that's a fair point to say. This is an organised actions and violence against the public, against innocent people, by the far right to create a change, to influence policy. So it is the definition of terrorism we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, it's really scary. And I went to this counter-protest in Manchester, and afterwards the far right, we kind of just sat in one area in the centre of this town, and I was wandering around, and then you could just hear them using like racist words. They were getting agitated with this. I saw this photographer, he was black photographer, and they were really just shouting at him. And it's just like, you don't really have legitimate concerns if you're shouting. You're just choosing random people to shout at, and then those random people happen to be ethnic minor, like not white, basically. And then, did you see there was a video in Hull? I mean, it's hard to talk about this because I haven't seen this verified if this actually happened, but there was a video in Hull of people attacking a car and trying to drag people out. It's really, really scary.
It is really scary at the moment, and I speak to a lot of people who are directly affected by this, and communities are in fear. They are absolutely terrified. People scared to leave their homes. I know people who are going into hiding at the moment because they are so scared of what's going to happen. And now we're having reports that on Wednesday they're going to be targeting organisations and charities who support migrants and asylum seekers. This is very coordinated, but it's a very scary time. And I'm saying this as, you know, white bloke sitting in my office, but for minorities, particularly Muslims, they are being targeted directly on the streets by people who have no concern for any public safety or supporting communities or protecting children. There were children in the hotel they tried to set alight. They are just pushing a racist Islamophobic agenda for their own ends.
And it's not just like crazy. Maybe I shouldn't say that. It's not just far right agitators online. It's also like, government ministers, but not the current government ministers, I don't think, but previously the Tory government people and journalists in right wing newspapers, like I said, are trying to justify this. It's just not justifiable in any way.
No, we're seeing some very mainstream people who they'll say, well, we condemn the violence, but and then come up with all these ridiculous excuses for it and try and legitimize almost what's happening and normalize it. And these aren't people there with their shaved heads and tattoos. These are the people who go on mainstream news programs and are asked to talk about these sorts of things, who it's that but. There is no but with this. These are rioters causing fear in our communities. If you follow that with but, you're automatically legitimising what they're doing, and they'll hear that. That's the point of a dog whistle, is it's heard by the groups who need to hear it, and they're going to hear that.
And I know you've got to go in a few minutes, but one of the things I've seen people saying is, these far right people, then their groups are not far right. Those people are not inciting violence, but it's just a continuous cascade, years of lies that turn these people against, want to harm migrants because they see them as other or something.
Exactly. Yeah, we have for years, and it's important to stress this isn't actually party political, because you go back to the Blair government, some of the language that was used then and the policies that were used then really fed into this as well. This has been building for years and years and years, because all people see are these negative portrayals of migrants. And I say it's the frequency illusion, because quite often when I post stuff, I'll have someone go, well, look at this one headline about one person. So, well, yeah, you know what? In any group, there will be good people and bad people. You arrest and call out the bad people. You don't target the whole group because of them. There is no other way that this would be accepted, But for some reason, these people think that when it's migrants, when it's asylum seekers, when it's Muslims, that it's fine to target a whole community because of the actions of one person. Now, statistically, migrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens, particularly refugees. Refugees have far more to lose than the average person if they're arrested for a violent crime, so they don't commit them. And there's a lot of evidence to support. There's been studies all over the world about this. But this misinformation has been just so embedded and normalised by government ministers. You look at some of the statements made by the previous government, including the previous Home Secretaries, not just one of them, but many, previous immigration ministers. They are factually incorrect and they are inflammatory statements. But they aren't challenged in the media a lot of the time. It's like, okay, we're going to have balance. So on this side, we're going to have somebody stating facts. And on this side, we're going to have somebody who has gone completely off the rails. And we're going to try and treat them as if they're both equal in measure. That doesn't work. What we need to see is not just a change of language from politicians, but the media to actually go, no, that's actually a lie. Let's call it what it is. And until we start seeing that, we're going to keep seeing stuff like this.
Yeah, that's what I fear. It seems to these kind of spurts of violence will happen every now and then, right? It's not, what's happening now is not new. It's happened before and probably happen again until we address these root issues. I want to move on to my last question, because I know you've got a few minutes to go before you've got to go. Was there anything else you want to say about the riots?
No, I think that covers a lot of it there.
I could talk about this for days.
That's the thing.
My last question is, I always ask people at the end of the podcast about the future, how they think the future's going to go, and I like it. I get really happy if they can say something positive. So, Dan, how do you feel about the future, and have you got any hope for us?
I do. I actually do have hope for us. What we're seeing, first of all, we have a new government who are new in the role, and hopefully we'll see what's happening, we'll see what's going on, and listen to the experts in the field and start changing that language, as I keep saying. But also what we're seeing is, this sounds really strange, I know, with the riots, we're seeing communities come together to stand against them. We're seeing communities come together to support each other. And I'm hopeful that because the far right are a minority, they don't represent the majority of views, and that's shown time and time again, that they've almost shot their bullet on this one. And those mainstream agitators who try and support and legitimise them have found that they have rowed themselves so far out into the water that they can't get back now and be taken seriously again. That's what I'm hoping, is that this is a wake-up call for a lot of people to go, oh, this is what happens when we try and demonise migrants. This is what happens. They attack our communities, our friends, our colleagues and co-workers, our neighbours. Because it's always shown that areas with higher immigration have lower anti-immigration sentiments. Now people are seeing that they're attacking people who are innocent, who are just living their lives. I'm hopeful that this will cause sort of almost a reversal where people start going, no, we need to stand with our communities now. And we're seeing that in response to a lot of these riots. And I think that's something we can build on and have hope for the future, that it unites people more than the far right want to divide them.
Absolutely. And one of my favourite chants, like when I've been on counter-protest before, is they'll sing, there are many, many more of us than you. And I always think, yes, there are. And that's always like a ray of hope, I think.
Exactly. Absolutely agree.
Well, Dan, this was a really great chat. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
And how can people follow you and see more of your work? I can link to it in the show notes, but it's probably better for people to hear it.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at stand_for_all. You can find me on most social media channels as Daniel Sohege. Apparently, there seems to only be one of me. I hope. I've recently started a TikTok, but probably don't follow that one because I'm not good at it. But yeah, Twitter is my main one.
I think TikTok is the future for this kind of stuff, but I'm not very good. I hate being on video. I just prefer
I'm too
my
old to
voice.
get used to it.
All right, Dan Sohege, thank you very much for coming on, and I'll be in touch.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.
All right, that was episode 61 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks again to Dan for coming on the podcast and speaking to us. It was really great to get him on. I've wanted to get him on here for a while, so thanks, Dan. Yes, what do I need to tell you? Go check out the blog, civilfleet.com. Check out the stories that we've got on there, and I'll hopefully start updating that again soon. Also, if you like what we're doing, then you can help us to continue to platform the awesome people that we've had on here. You can donate a small amount of money, like the price of a coffee, or you can donate the cost of a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or a private jet or something like that if you wish. To do that, you can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Our costs to make this podcast are very, very low, but any help will be greatly appreciated, and it also motivates me. And you can get access to the bonus episode we have on there, and I'm hoping to do some more of those in the near future. So yeah, go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet to make a donation there, and share us around on social media. That always helps. Spread the word, and yeah, I'll be back soon with another episode, I think, and I hope you're enjoying the summer. Cheers.